Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to have a talk this year again on the SUDC, and I want to talk and explain you about the necessary to have a good backup management strategy. So why is it important to have a good backup strategy? First of all, obvious, in case there is a disaster, you want to be able to restore the data on your HSM. But it's also good that you want to be sure that the data that you took is restored identically on the HSM, so there's no corruption happening. And also the backups that you're going to make, you want to protect them. You don't want them to be accessible to other people. So security of the backups is also an important factor. Of course, we have our HSMs, we have key management on our HSMs, but we also offer backup capabilities of the HSMs. We can create a device backup, which is basically the entire data of the HSM, includes the network configuration, but also the security settings and the user data. I'll comment on that in a minute. We also have a functionality for management backup, which is for GDPR reasons. So it excludes user data, but it's just the raw configuration and the network settings of the HSMs. We can make a backup of that as well. And then as an end user, whether you're in the cloud or local end user of the HSMs, you can also make your own backup. And for those backups, we also have the restore capabilities. So we can do a backup on the same device. We can restore a backup on a different device, whether it's for migration purposes or in case of a disaster. And in case you also can do selective restores. And selective restore means I can just restore a user partition, again, on the same device in case I had accidentally deleted an email, an account or a key, or I can do a selective restore on another device, for example, for migration from an on-premise device into the cloud or the other way around. And we'll come on that later on. So what I want to talk about today is the core key concepts that are relevant with regards to making backups. Again, the types of backups that we can make and the content of the data that's related and stored in the backups, the actual backup and restore procedures, and then special considerations, best practices, and some troubleshooting cases where you might run into issues and how to prevent them in the future from happening. So in case we're going to make a backup from the HSM, the backup needs to be protected, and it's protected by a restore password. So whenever we're going to make a backup from the HSM, the backup is protected with a restore password. And the restore password is shown once you created the backup. You have to write it down, make a photocopy from it, and you have to store that in a safe place, because without a backup password, you cannot restore a backup on a HSM. We also have a key concept that's called restore encryption pin. And the restore encryption pin allows you backups created on one device to be migrated to another device. The typical use case here is if we have a disaster within HSMs, HSM is beyond repair, you still have a backup. You can restore that backup onto a second HSM. Therefore, you need your password, but I need also the key originating from the original HSM in order to re-encrypt my backup onto a second HSM. And that's where we have our restore encryption pin. You need to retrieve this pin from the HSMs when you set it up. If you don't do it at that time and your HSM is broken, for example, you cannot retrieve that restore encryption pin from it. So therefore, if you set up a HSM, make sure you retrieve that restore encryption pin from the HSMs, you write it down and store it in a safe place. The final aspects, when we talk about making backups, we have the Genesis card, which is basically the card that belongs to the owner of the HSM. That allows the owner to do two-factor authentication, for example, on our X-series HSMs, where we have to integrate the smart card slots. And we have also the operator cards or the security officer cards that are the red cards. And they are used by the security officers for managing the HSMs on a daily basis. So configuration aspects, onboarding new users, they typically authenticate against the HSM with the red card. So with that all settled, we can talk about the backup types that we have on the HSMs. And as mentioned, we have a device backup. Device backup is basically a complete backup from all the user data, including the configuration of the HSMs, the security settings, basically everything that you'll need to restore the HSM in a unique and similar way. We have the management backup functionality. That's basically security settings and network settings, as well as the security officers that manage the HSMs. But they exclude anything regarding user data that's stored on a HSM or partition. Typical use cases where this is used is for GDPR purposes. They don't need to, are not allowed to have user data. And finally, we have an individual backup from a user. In the cloud, for example, a user can make his own backup with the help of the Dingelstad terminal that we have over here. But we also can have on-premise installations where we have tenants, for example, managing a partition for a root CA that want to make their own backup of the key material, and they want to exclude the security officers from accessing those partitions. So they can also make their own backup of a partition there. So if you look on the table, what's included basically in the different backups, if you have a device backup, it's everything, it's all the user data, it's all the credentials, it's including security operators and even the pairings with the Dingelstad devices that are stored in a backup. The management backup basically excludes all the user data, user credentials, user key materials, and objects. Individual user just has its own partition, has its own partition security officer credentials backed up, and its own partition security configuration of the partition. All the user data from the other partitions, it's not part of a user backup. So how do I create a backup typically? So typically, make sure that we know in which mode the HSM is operating. And I'm operating in a one-factor authentication. That's typically the case if you use an e-device and you don't use it with a Dingelstad terminal. You just have username and password for authentication from managing the HSMs. X devices are typically managed with two-factor authentication, but we can also change e-devices and pair them with a Dingelstad terminal that allows us to manage those devices with two-factor authentication. It's important that we know how we operate the HSM, because I need to restore. If I do a restore, I need to have the same authentication mode configured on my HSM. Otherwise, I cannot do a restore. I need to have the Genesis card, my security officer cards available, and the pins, in case I'm working with two-factor authentication. And I need to specify my backup location. Until version 3, we only could make backups on a USB drive, either attached to a Dingelstad terminal or on the device itself. And as of version 3, we also have now the possibility to make backups on a web dev server. So you can configure the HSM to use an external web dev server for storing configuration data, retrieving configuration data, but also for storing backups. Once I've done those prepared steps, I go on, log into the HSM, I authenticate myself with the security officers, and just select the device backup option. I need to provide my Genesis credentials. Basically, the owner of the device needs to authenticate himself as well. And then the backup is made to your preferred destination, USB drive or web dev server. If everything goes well without errors, we'll be presented with the restore password, which you either need to write it down or you can make a photocopy of it. If in doubt, if you have read the password correctly, there's a verification function on the HSMs that allows you basically to verify the backup against the password that you wrote down to make sure you wrote it down correctly. If I want to restore a backup onto my HSMs, I kind of need to do the steps in reverse. So I have to make sure that I know my authentication mode. If I use a restore on a E-series device and it's configured in one-factor mode, and I had made previously a backup with two-factor authentication, I need to pair it first with a Dingelstad terminal, switch it to two-factor authentication mode, and then can do a restore there. Make sure that you have your backup, you have your cards, and also have the restore password. Then you log into the HSM, select the restore options. You can do that on newly configured device, so where you haven't run yet a wizard to configure a HSM completely. You can also do it on a completely configured HSM already. So in both cases, you have the option to do a restore. If you do a restore, it will go through. It will ask you to enter the restore password. And once the restore has been performed, you check if everything went correctly. So typically, it will restore all the network settings, security officer settings, and all the user data. I can also do a restore on a different device. So in case I had a HSM was broken, have to return it for an RMA case, I get a replacement device, for example, I can restore the backup that I created from my original device onto a completely new device. Again, I need to check whether the configuration is correct with regards to the one-factor or two-factor authentication. But now I need not only my Genesis card and the security officer's card of my original device, I also need to restore encryption pins from my old device and from my new device. This because the original backup is encrypted with a key that was stored on the original device. And the restore encryption pins allows me to re-encrypt it in order to be decrypted onto the new device. So basically, we select again the restore option. We have to provide the restore password. We have to provide the Genesis credentials of the old and the new device, so we can authenticate that we are the legitimate owner of the backup. Provide the restore encryption pins, and then the restore will be done on the new device. Again, afterwards, verify that everything is correctly and that all the data was sent over. In case you're managing a HSMs and a user accidentally deleted a key, you can choose to make a restore of an individual user partition onto the HSM. So you don't need to make a complete restore. You just do a restore, but rather than selecting a complete restore from the device, you select a restore of an individual user partition. Again, you will need the restore password, but you can also restore an individual partition onto another device. And in that case, we'll have again the use of the restore encryption pin in order to decrypt and re-encrypt the backup onto the new device. Individual users can make backup of their own partition with the help of the Dingelstad terminal. So they can basically manage their partition remotely, change configuration parameters, but they can also make backups. Typically, they make a backup and they'll restore it onto the HSM, and it's a straight process, matter of authenticating with the partition security officer cards, creating a backup and restoring straight onto the device. However, users can also migrate a single partition from an on-premise device into a cloud environment, for example, or the other way around. Then we need to, again, re-encrypt the backup and decrypt it onto the new system. And therefore, we have special case that we have a backup partition card. A backup partition card kind of holds the restore encryption pin. You need to create that upfront, and then you can migrate a backup from a single user partition onto another device. Again, make sure you have the two-factor authentication there. You know the restore password from the backup that you created, and have the partition backup card ready. So a few things coming from my presentation is that consistency is key. Make sure always that you know the setup of your device if you're operating it in one-factor or two-factor mode, because you cannot restore a backup with a one-factor authentication on a two-factor device or configuration. It's not possible. If you do so, you will have failures. Typically on the X devices, it's not an issue. E devices, because they come standard with one-factor authentication, you have to be careful if you have it paired with a Dingelstad terminal and then use it in two-factor authentication mode. Because if you have a new E device, it's standard in one-factor authentication mode delivered. So you need to pair it first with a Dingelstad, switch it to two-factor authentication, and you can do a restore. And if you do a restore, it will also generate you a new pairing file for your Dingelstad terminal, so it doesn't lock you out. Restore password, we need to keep that in a secret place. We also have to keep security of our Genesis and SO cards, because the Genesis cards belong to the device, but the SO cards belong also to the backup that I created before. Don't override security officer cards, because I've created a backup and I restore it on another device, and you might think, oh, I overwrite my SO cards because I don't longer need them. If I restore it, I still need the old SO cards back to operate the HSM. Also store your Genesis card and SO cards in multiple places. Use the Chrome functionality. Use the capability of creating a backup card from your Genesis cards. You won't be the first person to find out that if you have stored nicely your SO cards and Genesis cards in a vault next to your HSMs, and there is a disaster happening in your data center. I'm aware of a case where we had a customer in the past that had his data center flooded. All the cards were in an electric vault, couldn't break open the vault. All the cards were in there. If you had them stored nicely separated across different locations, it would be much easier for him. Also, make sure that you have audit procedures set up where you log where people and who has access to the cards. Making backups to web dev server is nice. Making backups to a backup USB stick is nice, but make sure that you duplicate your information stored across different places. Don't find out that your backups are corrupted on the server just in case when you need them. Keep things duplicated. If you just generate keys on an annual basis for a PKI environment, make a backup afterwards. There's no real need to do that then sequentially if you're not generating new key material. However, if you do regular new key generations, key rotations, the old backups don't need to contain your new key material. So make sure you create new backups on a regular basis if you create new key material. Also consider using our key invalidation feature. Key invalidation means it's a soft bin from keys that are deleted on the HSMs. They are copied into a shadow bin that allow them to be easily restored. So you don't need to go back to a restore of a user partition. You can easily restore them with security officer's credentials in case a user has accidentally deleted a key. And finally, test the backup strategy that you have so that you know what steps that you need to make in order to do a restore. You don't want to find it out once you have confronted with a situation like that. Nearing the end, if we make a backup from a HSM, the HSM will block user APIs, and that's for consistency. Meaning if I'm creating a backup from my HSMs, I cannot create in parallel new keys over the APIs. So client applications will be blocked. Consider that if you're doing maintenance or if you're going to make a backup from your system, clients cannot access keys at the time you're creating a backup. If you run a cluster environment that you have configured failover correctly, you can take one HSM cryptographically offline, block it, the APIs for maintenance purposes. You can create a backup. Client applications, if you have failover correctly configured in the provider, fall back to the other HSMs in your cluster in that case. So, few practical troubleshooting topics. Make sure you know the restore password. If you have not written down the restore password correctly, you cannot perform a restore. Also, make sure, if in doubt about the restore password when you created a backup, use the verification functionality. So you can play in a backup, select it, enter the verification or the reset store password, and the HSM will tell you whether they match with each other, yes or no. Make sure that you have the same authentication mode selected on the HSM, 1-factor versus 2-factor. Don't lose or override SO cards. If you override your SO cards, you can still restore a backup, but you cannot access the HSM afterwards. Have a large quorum. Don't use 2 from 3, consider something from 2 from 5. You can add multiple SO cards. Restore password, as mentioned before. Creating backups, as mentioned, consider storing them in 2 different locations on your servers. Make sure not everybody gets access to those locations, although they are protected by a password. And again, do not write your SO cards. With that, I'm through my presentation. So I hope you have some better insight into your backup practices for the HSMs. You have a better understanding about the different backup strategies that we have for making a backup from your complete device, user partitions, or even for management purposes. I hope you have a better understanding about the need for a restore password and the restore encryption pin when it's needed, and the role of the SO cards there, and as important, be consistent with your procedures and how you operate the HSMs. Thank you.